So you want to be a deer farmer. Or what do you think of deer farmers? You know, I see that term used. I see it in comments kind of like that's a bad thing. You know, there's a turn now where there's a lot of people going out and hunting public land, and I think that's a great thing. And it's funny because a lot of people are hunting the same public land areas. Meaning that everyone goes to these certain areas. I don't know if you hear about it online or what, and then there's so much public land that is absolutely untouched. So all the time I hear about people that complain, well, it's public land, it's overrun, I can't find a place to hunt. Maybe that's you, that you don't know where to hunt because your favorite public land spot that you've hunted for 15 years. Well, I'm here, I talk about moving. Just, you know, if you always do what you've always done, you always get what you had, you know that phrase. And if you keep going to the same spot and you're running into a lot of people, just move. Because I can guarantee you, because we see it all the time, we see it up against private parcels, incredible private parcels with giant bucks, you'd be shocked that no one's hunting the private or the public land next door. And now it's hard to get into sometimes. It's not next to the parking area. They have to walk in a couple miles. I mean, I've walked up an hour and a half to get into a spot, hour and 45 minutes to get into a spot on public land. And then, of course, you don't see a lot of people when you do that. I think you eliminate 90-95%. But bottom line is there's that negative connotation that, well, you're just a deer farmer. And I want to discuss some of the differences between as a public land hunter and as a private land hunter. Now, I've shot about close to 30 bucks. I don't think it's been 30 bucks. I think more like 27, 28 bucks on public land throughout the years. It's going back into the 80s. So a very long time. And so I love public land. I love public land hunting. And I can tell you this right before we begin this. You can try to compare these two. And I'll even see people out there that are public land hunters, so they'll say Kentucky saddle hunter. And that implies that they're going out hunting in their saddle on public land and they're somehow more righteous than you that hunts on private land. I think people, whether you call it ignorantly or they make assumptions that one style is harder than the other or that one style is more fruitful than the other. I can tell you when it comes to sick bows and people hunting with recurve longbows, there's a reason that some of the best at that have a completely different class than, well, it's the same with open sights, with scopes, with compound bows. There are all these different classes when it comes to competition because not only are the scores significantly less for what people are aiming at, people that do it in competition, but their stakes are significantly closer. And so the point being is that just because you use a recurve doesn't mean you're holier than someone using a compound, someone using a crossbow. You can make someone say, well, I use a compound, so I'm better than that crossbow hunter over there. Well, what about that recurve hunter over here that's saying, well, you're using a compound, I'm using a recurve. Where does it end? We're all hunters. Who cares? The point is, I want you to maybe open your eyes, the difference between the two and what it really takes to be a, quote, deer farmer, and the amount of work it takes or to hunt public land. Both great ways to hunt, and I've enjoyed greatly both of them. You know, for one, obviously, if you're a, quote, deer farmer and you're hunting private land, then you have to own land, lease land, or use it. You know, use some. And in that order, you have more control when you own it, you have less control when you lease it, and you have very little control when you use someone else for the land. Meaning that they might wise up that, that land's worth $4,000 a year if they lease it, and that money means something to most people, or $2,000 or $1,000. You know, nowadays, a decent whitetail parcel, for that to be only $1,000 or $500, those days are gone, if it's at market value. Even a 40-acre parcel, it's hard to find one that's under $1,200 and $1,500, $2,000. You know, that would be the going rate. And in some good areas, that 40-acre parcel, Dylan, you've probably seen some 40-acre parcels. I remember I thought you were looking at one in Buffalo County one time, or there's one up there. What kind of prices have you seen?
I mean, you're seeing absolutely crazy prices right now where, you know, it could be up to $4,000 for a 40, you know, which is just astronomical compared to what it was 5 years ago. Right.
Yeah, and certainly I started leasing land in 2002 was our first year here in Wisconsin, and what we paid for that land then would probably be 1/4 of what it was now, maybe at least 1/3 of what it was, you know, somewhere around in there, so significantly higher. And I haven't been, you know, in the market for leasing land, other than we do have a lease piece we have, and I do know that I give the landowner a raise every year without him asking for a raise. We do it just because I know land prices go up, so we just keep giving him more money and helping out with bulldozing, helping out with big expenses on the land because we take advantage of those improvements as well. So it's not just, hear this, or giving them an old pair of binoculars, that kind of thing, where you want to make them happy and you want to keep up a good relationship. So it costs money to do so. But that land that Dylan's talking about, let's say it's 40-acre parcel for $4,000, that land is probably worth $6,000 an acre. So think about that in relation to that piece. You're leasing a land for $4,000 a year that's worth $250,000. So that's the other option, is to actually own it. So that being aside, obviously that's different than public land. Public land, you just go hunt it. You don't have to worry about ownership, taxes, anything. And I can say when I hunt public land, I do in a more relaxed state. And we'll talk about some of that right here. But I'm more relaxed hunting public land than I am private land. I love the challenge of private land and public land. There's challenges with both, albeit different in some respects. But when I go to public land, I do so and I enjoy it. I relax. I don't have to worry about some of the things that we have to really worry about on private land. I was talking to Dylan right before the shoot, and one of those challenges is if you have 40 acres, if you have 200 acres, if you have 500 acres, and you hunt haphazardly, or if you hunt with too many people, you can ruin that land, even if it's a few hundred acres, all at one time, one weekend. You can make it so that land is worth less for hunting the next weekend after. It takes 3 weeks, 4 weeks for it to fully heal, if you have good food on it. Where Dylan, he just went out to South Dakota. He shot a beautiful buck, do it yourself, hanging in a tree. And, he got it. It's a story all in itself. But I asked him, I said, how many places do you have in South Dakota that you hunt? And he's scouted and he's familiar with about eight different spots.
Not enough. Always thinking about more, always looking at the map.
And that's what he does here. Like, I think we joked around about that before he went out to South Dakota last week. He was over there looking at his phone while he just makes sure it's running still, and it's recording. He doesn't have to do much.
And the red dot.
And then the other thing he was watching is he's looking at his mapping on his phone, just trying to figure out that next great spot that he can hunt. So, and that's, as a public land hunter, is something different. It's more refreshing because if I burn out one spot, I can go to the next. So completely different with ownership though. Number two, you want to, on private land, if you just sit there and go hunt private land, you might as well just own public land. If you're not going to do anything with it, I know a lot of great public land areas that are big, remote, and have giant bucks on in almost every state that would be watching this, at least in the north half of the country. There's a lot of good public land out there, way more than you would think if you're down about hunting public land. I actually see comments online where people say, I'm done with hunting. I went out and there's too many people on public land and I don't want to go anymore. What a defeatist attitude. And it just tells me they're not real passionate about whitetails, because if they were, they'd go find a spot where there's not a lot of people. I've hunted in areas of Pennsylvania where there's literally 25 cars at one turnoff to go in a spot. Well, that's not where I go. I go down the road where there's 6 or 7 cars, and it's a 3 by 3 mile area with giant hills, and then I go back in the middle, and it's crazy how there'd be that many cars in the area, and you see one hunter walk by during the day. And that's it, sitting dark to dark and going out there. Bottom line is, when you're on private land, you should create good habitat. You can't just sit back and say, I got private land, I'm going to have a good hunt. That's what a lot of people on public land don't realize. I'd rather hunt public land if I didn't put the work in on private land. That's why owning land, if I couldn't plant food plots, I wouldn't own it. Why own a piece of private land that you can't make an attraction on, that if your neighbors do so 3 miles away, 2 miles away, you're not going to see any deer? You have to. And it's not even keeping up with the Joneses. It's fun. It's fun working the land. It's fun planting. And that's where it might come into that connotation of deer farmer. That explanation of deer farmer. So you have to work at that, and it's creating the highest level of attraction. But number 3, you have to balance that level of attraction. Public land, you just hike, you look for that attraction. It's always changing. Private land, you're trying to make that attraction for the entire fall. Bedding area and food sources. You can't have one without the other. If you have high quality food, but you have bad bedding, it's open timber, they're going to live on the neighbors. Now you're putting food on your land, putting deer on your neighbors. On the flip side, if you have great cover but no food, the deer are going to live on your neighbors because they're going to go to find food somewhere else. So you have to have one with the other, and so you're always looking at building that level of attraction to the highest you can. Different on public land because you go find this late season food source, let's say clear cuts. You find this early season food source, let's say white oak acorns. Let's find red oaks in between. Let's find an old homestead with apple trees on it somewhere. Let's find public land that backs up to ag land, but it's tilled field corn, so there's nothing there from mid-October on. Maybe it was beans, so it's really hot early. Maybe it's winter wheat, so it's really hot in December when it's warm out. So you can find those pieces, you just have to hike more and scout more. So that's a little bit different. Balancing the highest level of attraction, because if you make your land too attractive, and this is a thing, folks out there, especially some of you public land hunters, if you have private land, you make your land too attractive, meaning every square inch is attractive, then you can't step foot on the property without spooking deer. And you know what happens when deer run? They run a half mile, even in the best case circumstance. When you spook them, they don't just run 200 yards and sit and look back. They run. They're not like a rabbit, or just runs around the corner in some thick brush and stops. That's not whitetail. They're a half mile away. You know, a half mile is basically, if you look at a half mile square, it's 160 acres. So you spook deer on one side of the 160 and they're running into your land, they're going through the outside, leaving. They're on the neighbor's property on the other side. Let alone if you actually go into the property then. That's just starting on the outside. And so if you make your land too attractive and you can't move around the property and make smart decisions for hunting, meaning be able to get in and out of the land without spooking deer, and this is the number one failure of private land. That's why we have so many clients. Because everyone that buys land, they're going to improve it. They sink a lot of money into there. Maybe there's 2 or 3 partners. Maybe it's just one individual. But they put food plots in, they put water holes, they put mock scrapes, they create bedding areas, they create native switchgrass or grass plantings, and now they put all this great habitat in there, but it's not put together in a manner that allows them to hunt the land effectively. In fact, every improvement they make, and this is over 90% of all landowners, every improvement they make, they're worse off because it creates a nocturnal parcel and all the deer live somewhere else. And isn't it nice to be a public land hunter next door? Because I know a lot of great parcels that we go to that they do that. They spook off the deer, they make them nocturnal. The deer live actually on the public land in an area no one hunts. And you can go back and sit there if you're a savvy public land hunter, wait for the deer to come into your lap. And I know a lot of you out there that have success in public land a lot do that. Dylan, this won't call out any certain areas, but how far were you from, I don't know if it was the original spot you told me you were hunting from ag. I know you had talked about a winter wheat field and green and stuff like that.
Where I shot that buck, maybe 150 yards from ag.
Okay. So basically you're trying to capture those deer when they're coming in and out or get a good look at them.
Transition between the food and the bedding.
Yeah, and that's smart. Like I know areas in Ohio where we've hunted on big, tens of thousands of acres, where you go in 2 miles and now you're a quarter mile back from private land where they have, could be golf courses, ag fields, food plots, bait piles on private land in Ohio, but not public land. That's a smart hunting tactic. And so just a little secret out there for you guys. But bottom line is that you have to manage that level of attraction. And again, the more improvements you make on private land, the worse you are off, over 90% of all people. So we get to their land usually in year, there's people that are smart and they say, well, we're going to do this day one. We're going to have you come out and help design the land. There's some people that wait till year 7, 5 to 7 years. And then they look back and they can say through history, this property's gotten worse every year. Why? We've done more every year. And that's definitely a diminishing return factor that we see over and over again with private land. Public land, what's the answer? You just scout more. Just move. Dylan has 8 spots out there, and I can guarantee by the end of the year, next year, he'll probably have 15 or 12 or whatever the number is. You keep adding, you keep knowing that if you go in here, this is how you can hunt it. You look for sign, you look for fresh sign, no fresh sign. If there's people there, you just leave and go somewhere else. Go find a different spot. And so that's completely different with public land. You have to make smart decisions on private land because, again, with your hunting decisions, if you make poor decisions, if you go in, you don't worry about the wind. If you think that blind's going to cover your scent, it doesn't. If you think you can just drive through because you have screening on either side and you forget about the wind when you're going in and out of stands. If you don't worry about how much sound you're making, you're going to spook deer off your land. You make your property a nocturnal property, and all that money you have invested, because again, ownership is the most expensive form, not to mention all the improvements you put on there, then you're worse off than you were when you started. And that's why a lot of private land hunters fail. It's really, and I talk about the fantasy land states. It's sure different in Kansas. You can get away with a lot of, I've gone to Kansas. I can remember helping a new hunter out, and literally it was a 2nd-year deer hunter, and he was green enough that I had to help him load his Ruger 1022 and show him how to do that. And so he shot a 6-7-year-old buck the first year there, and just followed the advice, followed the plan, didn't know any different, and just went in and shot a big buck. And I'm not saying that's overly common, but when you get into some of those states, Kansas, Iowa, Missouri, some of the areas where you have a large broken areas where there's not a lot of hunters, then you can get away with a lot more because the deer are a little bit more used to of less intrusion. They don't really care. They don't care about cameras on trees. You can put your water holes. You don't have to bury them in the ground like we do up north here a little bit more, where deer are a little bit more spooky. Box blinds, they don't care about it as much. You can put it more on so you get away with a little bit more in those areas, but that's a very small percentage of hunters. Most people, again, the more you do, the more of a diminishing return you have. The difference on public land, you just go find another spot. Again, a lot less stress. Because when I go out on the property here in Minnesota, we have a lot of stands that stretched out over a long distance, and even in Wisconsin, we have a lot of stands, even though it's about 30 acres of cover that we hunt. But when we go hunting in those areas, if we make one bad decision, especially in Wisconsin, that could have a negative effect for a week or two. And to where, why even bother hunt? You know, we don't, there's no sign, there's no fresh sign, something could come through, but we can't afford to mess up because we're only dealing with 30 acres or 200 acres or 500 acres, whatever it might be. I don't have any 500 acres on. The bottom line is if we mess that up, you're a private land hunter, where do you go? Unless you have some public land that you can go to and that's your spot. But a lot of times you're spending so much time improving the private land that you don't have time to go scouting and look for public land around your area. You spend a lot of hours. I know on here we spend weeks amount of time, whether it's mowing, spraying, whatever we might, let alone planting and everything else, and putting up stands and blinds, water holes, filling water holes, mock scrapes, cameras, whatever it might be. It's funny, you know, people will talk about this with cameras. You know, people talk about, well, it's easy when you have cameras on private land. You know, cameras are easy to keep from deer. You know, you put them 6 feet high. We've been preaching that. I've been preaching that for 15 years, 12, 15 years, been writing articles about that, how to hide your trail camera. Keeping them high, keeping on a tree next to it, or keeping them low. We even find that if it's below sight, that's okay too. But you have to have a background. You have to have the profile hidden. Use blackout cameras. So cameras don't help the average person other than they know those deer are there. But they don't help develop a strategy to kill them, because most of the time the cameras are spooking deer, meaning the use of the cameras by the hunter is spooking deer and making more of a nocturnal herd. And I'm not saying they don't help people. What I'm saying is that they hurt people a lot. Because if you're not careful, again, you have to make, whether it's camera use, access to stands, which stand, managing your scent. It is a very tight, highly controlled game if you're successful on private land over and over and over again. Who's a better hunter? A successful public land hunter or a successful private land hunter? You can make a case for either. But just because you're on a public land hunter and you're finding success doesn't mean you're holier than thou. And just because you're a private land hunter finding success, it doesn't mean you can do it on public land. There's a balance between the two. Something that's really different with private land. We've seen a lot of private lands where there's way too many does. And that can be a very bad thing because all the bucks live somewhere else. People say, oh, we have 10 does for every buck. Well, that just means that there's 3 or 4 bucks out of those 10 living somewhere else. You just don't see them. So right away when someone says we have 10, 11, 12 does for every buck, in most cases it's because they're doing something wrong. Because does and fawns take a lot more hunting pressure, and they're a lot more tolerant, and their home range is just a fraction of what a buck is. So they're more tolerant to stick around. If that's the food source they want and that's the bedding area, if that bedding area gets spooked out, they just go over here and hit that food source after dark. But they'll stay close. Mature bucks just leave. And then they'll leave for the whole season. So you can't afford to make mistakes. You can't afford to have a water hole sticking up 1 or 2 feet in the air that looks like the side of a bear when there's bears in the area, and deer don't like bears. They don't like those containers that looks unnatural. You can't put your cameras out where they can see them, these boxes. You can't put your blinds on food plots. You can't go to a stand and blow your scent in the wrong direction one time, because it doesn't just have an effect for that stand location. You can count out 150 to 200 yards in any direction. You can't afford to go to a morning stand in the afternoon and spook deer out of a bedding area. And likewise, you can't go to a food source stand in the morning and spook deer out of the food source, because then they're not in the bedding area, they're not in the food source. Either the next morning or the next afternoon. So you can't afford to make mistakes, because on public land, what's different is you can just move. Go find another spot. You do like Dylan, you've done your homework, you scout from the air. And so I just want you guys to see these differences. You'll show me a successful, consistent private land hunter. I'm going to show you someone who's highly dedicated, makes smart decisions, and works over and over again. There's the exception. You have the little river system, western Illinois property that's 20 acres of cover. It's between giant sections of wood, and it's surrounded by ag on 2 sides. and you just watch this thoroughfare during the rut of monster bucks come through. There's always that exception, and that can happen with a private land or a public land piece. There's a lot of public land. I look at some of the public land hunters that I know that hunt metropolitan areas, where they get on properties and subdivision properties that no one else has permission to. And they're hunting subdivision deer that are used to sound, used to scent, used to seeing people, and they don't really care. They're going out and feeding that apple tree under someone's front yard every day, no matter what, right out in the daylight. It's completely different. Bottom line is, to be successful at either, like with public land and Dillon, you have to scout a lot, you have to work hard, you have to have lots of spaces, and you have to hike a lot. Private land, you're gonna have to work hard, spend a lot of money, make smart hunting decisions, because even on public land, if you have a lot of spots and you've scouted, you're just really dedicated and passionate, even if you make bad hunting decisions, if you have lots of spots to move to, and the one decision you can make correctly is that you spooked out a spot or destroyed a spot. If you can do that correctly, then you just go on to your next spot, look for fresh sign, always hunt fresh sign. And someone who doesn't have a lot of hunting skill can find bucks because they've done their homework and put their boot time in and their eye time in by looking at maps and understanding aerials and topos and figuring out a formula where those bucks are moving and translating that same formula into other areas, even it might be other states too, that have similar terrain. So I want you guys to think about that. You know, if you're a public land hunter and you're jealous of private land hunters that seem to find success, I know a lot of people that wouldn't want to do that kind of work. You know, because if they're jealous and they're really uninformed that much about a private land hunter, that tells me that they're probably not going to be the type of person. They're probably lazy. They're probably not going to be the type of person to do the work. And likewise, there's a lot of private land hunters. You look at a public land hunter that has success. They're not doing it illegally. You can do it out there, but they're probably spending a lot of hiking time. You know, when you're at bowling league, when you're fishing, when you're doing whatever, they're out in the woods, they're scouting. I know Dylan's checked out new spots, and he's put cameras out in new spots. He's scouted new spots, and he'll go out, and I'm just not seeing much here. But he's taking the leg time. Some of those remote, I know you had a remote one recently where you're soaking a camera, and you went out there. For one, no one stole your camera, so that shows it's remote.
Didn't get a picture of anybody else either, so that tells you how remote it was.
Yeah, and this is Wisconsin.
Yeah, this is not far from my house, actually, central Wisconsin. It's a very heavily hunted piece as well.
But you just went in a ways.
Just went in a ways, found a spot I figured would be away from people, and I had pictures of 2 mature bucks on it. Unfortunately, they were both white bucks, which we have a lot of in our area, so
Yeah.
They were not legal bucks to kill.
And how much time did it take you to get in there, and how much time do you think you had scouting one spot?
It's an 80 deep in this area, and I just stumbled on this spot while taking a walk with my rifle last year, just on a day where I had nothing to do during gun season. I said, you know what, I've never walked this piece before, see what I can get into, and found a spot. I said, man, this would be a cool spot to hunt in early November. I gotta get back in and throw a camera.
And that's, again, what it takes. It's so different than on private land. You have all this work, you have a list. That's why we do our monthly deer chores. But public land, you can never stop looking for another spot. You can never stop scouting. I remember when I was out in Pennsylvania, I've hunted that from 93. The last time I hunted was a couple years ago. But yeah, I've 20 gun seasons on public land out there since 93. But we went out for family vacation in the 90s and the 2000s. I would take 2 hours and go check out a new area. Sometimes it took 2 hours to get into that area, 2 hours back. So I'd always look at, okay, I have 3 hours. Sometimes I'm going to walk for an hour and a half, 2 hours, and then I need to make tracks back to the truck. But that was during the spring. That was during the summer. We actually cross-country skied into the area on some of the trails that weren't cross-country ski trails. But if the snow conditions were good, we could get back far into locations, even work our way uphill and come back out through the trees downhill, kind of backcountry. But it was all year long. Every time we spent time out there, which was 5-6 times a year, then you're making 2 or 3 days out of your 5 days you're there, a long weekend, you're going out a couple times, and this afternoon, and you're scouting and getting to know the area. And then after, 25 years, all of a sudden you have an accumulation of events and experiences that help you get to know an area over a 3 by 6 mile area, or, a large area. And bottom line is, though, both require a lot of work. I wouldn't be jealous of the one or the other, because if you're successful, it requires a different amount of work for the same amount of success. but it requires a huge amount of effort. And no, if you're a public land hunter not finding success, then move, change, find a completely different area, look for fresh sign, follow the fresh sign. It's going to change throughout the season. If you're a private land hunter not finding success, then make sure you can actually balance the level of attraction that you're trying to make. You can get on and off the property like a predator and not spook deer. You know, not spooking deer on either one. You can preserve your public land spots for longer if you're not spooking deer. The bottom line is you can change your hunt and the level of success that you have on either one. It requires hard work, but don't think the other one has it all because they're doing something different than you. We're all hunters, kind of getting back to the recurve, compound, crossbow. Who cares? You're a hunter. That's all that matters. Private, public land. The jealousy kills people. It divides. And bottom line is enjoy the hunt. Always look to improve yourself, and then you won't worry about any of this a few years down the road. I urge everyone out there to really check out my web classes. They've been wildly successful. We have one that details how you should design your land, another one that details how you should plant and maintain and manage a food plot program. How can you make those decisions that fit your land specifically and not someone else's? Unfortunately, there's so much information in the hunting industry that says you should do this, but it doesn't apply to you. These web classes directly apply to you. And then we have our third web class that came out last year, our rut web class, navigating the entire rut. And then we have our fourth one coming out, which is hunting hills and thermals. I urge you to check those out, try the web classes, and they're all about teaching, helping you understand how you can navigate, not only managing your property, food plots, and the rut, but also hunting strategically, hills, thermals, and wherever you pursue whitetails for your dream and your passion.